Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Thunguri AA Wash Process Kenya from Luna Coffee Roasters. There's the bag right there. And Luna, based out of Langley, British Columbia. And they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel on multiple occasions. However, it has been over a year since they were last featured on this channel. So I reached out to the owners of Luna and asked them for some suggestions. So the next few coffees we're going to be reviewing from Luna were all coffees that were directly suggested to us by the owners of Luna. So we'll see how they turned out, beginning with this Kenya, as this right here is day 40. And recipe we went with for this coffee was Luna's recipe, which is a 17:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 99 degrees Celsius, about 210 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee. So Luna did make a name for themselves by being one of the lightest roasting coffee roasters in the entirety of Canada, and that still holds true. I do have to say that their coffees might not necessarily be as uber light as some of the other coffee roasters out there, and even then, in comparison to some of the recent stuff we've had from September, it might not be necessarily as light as those coffees. But even then, I feel like a lot of people would consider this to be on the more moderately light side of things relative to the roast profile. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression, and we opted for the V60, and it came out classically Kenyan-like with an abundance of the dark tart berries right at the forefront, with plenty of lingering brightness in the cup as well. In addition to that, it improved a lot upon the cool down, with the listed stone fruits and a slight candied sweetness also being a lot more present, and a slight bit of savory aspects as well, giving it a pretty positive first impression. We continue on to day 17 as we opted for the Chemex and had slightly better results, as there was a little bit more clarity with a bit more focus on the sugary stone fruit aspects of the cup, much more in line with the listed mango-like aspects that they had on here. Herbality continues to be present, this time a little bit more pronounced in the finish itself, with plenty of those classic Kenyan brightness and floral components within it. So another good day. Couple nice positive first impressions. We continue on to day 20 as we opted for the April brewer, and there was a little bit more herbality to the cup as it continues to offer so many of those expected and notable Kenyan bright aspects to the cup. But it is complemented well by a strong herbality as well as a slight bitterness, with the focus being a little bit more on this foresty berry earthiness was kind of the best descriptor I had for it. So this day wasn't necessarily my favorite, but we would continue on to day 23, opting for the V60 with Luna's recipe, and this is the first time I noticed a notably better cup, as it offered a fair bit more sweetness and definition with some stronger berry attributes to the cup. There's a slightly herbal aspect and an almost graham cracker-like pastry sweetness as well. First time I'd really experienced that from this coffee, and it's something that would become a pretty prominent and notable factor from this point going forward, as there was a notable lingering savoriness to the cup, but that was kind of balanced out by the nicer aspects of this one, so significantly better on this day. We continue on to day 26. Opted for the Chemex with Luna's recipe, and this was actually the best that had been up to this point, as it had the most mango-like attributes to the cup with a notably cleaner all-around sense to it. The brightness is ever present with a stronger berry aspect yet again, so I'm just kind of noticing that this coffee has been trending in a positive direction just with time and some slight adjustments, but we're going to continue to see that trend go along, as on day 29 we opted for the V60 with Luna's recipe, and once again I came to that same conclusion that time has really done this coffee a lot of justice, as the best of it is experienced upon the cool down itself. That's definitely when I enjoyed the coffee the most, with so much more depth, plenty of that slight graham cracker like vanilla pastry sweetness, as it continues to linger a bit in a slightly more fruit sweet sense upon that cool down. Pretty nice day in that regard. Day 32, another try with the Chemex with Luna's recipe, and it was a close call as to which one I preferred, and I think I opted for the V60 just because I was offering a little bit more sweetness and a little bit more depth, as this continued to have a lingering tart berry aspect to it, complemented well by a strong florality, and a little bit more of a subtle stone fruit sense to it. Relatively clean with a nice amount of sweetness, but I don't necessarily think it did a lot of the other fruit factors justice and some of the other sweeter components to it. as on day 36, one last try through the V60 with Luna's recipe, and the cup was actually the best it had been up to this point. And here on day 40, I continue to experience that, as I feel like this coffee has continued to improve, hasn't necessarily tapered off at this point. Upon the lengthy cooldown, there are a great bit of fruit aspects in the finish. As mentioned, that previously listed graham cracker pastry sweetness is also present, but the stone fruit sweetness is in much more of a notable measure at this point, and the most pronounced it had been all the way up to this point. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have a lot of level 4s, so let's go through those, and we will start with the cleanliness level 4, and that's always going to be a pretty big deal when it comes to a Kenyan coffee for me, as this one right here from the start did seem to have some pretty nice definition to it. And given that it didn't have too many of these savory aspects, even with the adjustments we had made, that's going to be the key point in this coffee scoring that level 4 in terms of cleanliness. I would say maybe the slightly lower side of the level 4, but given that there weren't too many savory aspects to it, I felt it was a little bit more justified. Finish level 4. And this is once again right in line with the acidity. It's a washed Kenyan coffee. I would be surprised if it didn't at minimum reach that level 4 mark right there with the acidity, as that was fully expected going into it. And it did have a little bit of a lasting finish to it, but it was a finish that I very much enjoyed, as it was lacking too many of these savory qualities and aspects to it. And for that reason, it was a much more enjoyable experience in that sense. Sweetness level 4. Okay, I like Luna, maybe a slight bit generous, but even then I feel like this had a slight bit more sweetness than the average Kenyan coffee, so I do want to give them credit there in that sense, because it's not necessarily an overly sweet coffee, and I've definitely had some more coffees that were truly representative of that level 4, but given that this is a little bit more relative to some of the other Kenyan coffees we've reviewed on this channel, I could say that a 4, maybe lower side of the 4, is a better fit for this one. Acidity, already touched on that. Level 4, no surprises in any sense, as it was present right from the start. Florality, level 4, plenty of those more red-like floral components, those roses, those hibiscus-like aspects to it, and a little bit more of a savory sense, and a little bit more of that herbal sense, I should say. So for that reason, it was a little bit more in line with that hibiscus-like components to it. Definitely present, prominent, and the second most pronounced flavor profile throughout, though not necessarily mentioned too often, because I was focusing a little bit more on the fruit aspects, most specifically that berry fruit. Level 4, I think that they have something listed along the lines of a juniper berry, and honestly don't know what a juniper berry tastes like, but I am very familiar with blackberries, as they are my favorite of the berry fruits. So I could say a lot of those darker tart berries definitely present within this one, but then I think the other things really worth discussing go in line with that level 3. And since we're already at this part of the tasting wheel, we'll start with the citrus level 3, a little bit more of that kind of generic citric component that I often experience with Kenyan coffees in general, so I didn't necessarily want to point it towards a specific direction in this one. But the big one is the stone fruit at a level 3, because it's something that I kept mentioning so often throughout this one. And I think when it comes to Kenyan coffees in general, it's extremely rare for me to get it to the same level or extent as a lot of those berry aspects to them, as they seem to really dominate the cup. And then outside of that, the fruit components you're experiencing oftentimes can be in equal measure when it comes to citric components. But as far as the stone fruits, it's always difficult for me to get it up there to that level 4. I do have to say that this one really pushed that level, but given that it just didn't reach the same mark as the berry fruit aspects of it, I had to keep it there at that level 3 mark. A couple of other level 3s, caramel level 3, that does insinuate the candied sweetness, and once again, maybe slightly generous, though I think that there was enough sweetness to justify it within this coffee. And then last thing, well, two things worth discussing, but we'll start with this. Body at a level 3. Yes, this one definitely had a fair bit of texture to it, fully expected. We are working with a Kenyan coffee, so I definitely expected that much, and the V60 did seem to help with that as well. And then I think the last thing worth discussing is the savoriness at a level 2. I mentioned it very briefly, but given that I wasn't experiencing too many of those savory qualities, and again, it could be that I'm being a little generous on this tasting wheel, but at the same time, I don't think it was necessarily as overly pronounced as the very strong berry aspects, or even a lot of the fruit components in line with that stone fruit that I was experiencing from this one, so I felt like that was the best place to chart it. But as I am looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I did enjoy it, and I think maybe I still have to say that even though I enjoyed it, it's not necessarily going to be my type of coffee too much, because it did skew a little bit more on the classic Kenyan side of things, though it did have some nice redeeming qualities to it. I think it was just skewing a little bit more in that direction without necessarily offering enough to counterbalance those specific things for me. So for that reason, it was just feeling a little bit more like a well-done Kenyan as opposed to my type of Kenyan, which I do want to differentiate those two things, because a lot of people know that when it comes to these washed Kenyans, I'm looking for something that's extremely unique or that will stand out, because this more traditional profile isn't necessarily my sort of thing. But even with that being said, it reached two really important marks, and that was the sweetness and the clarity both being in a level 4, which isn't something I give too many Kenyan coffees, so massive credit to them in that sense, even if it didn't necessarily live up to what I was looking for a Kenyan coffee. That takes me to the type of person I would suggest this coffee to, and again, it's not me, it's much more of your traditional Kenyan coffee drinker that is looking for a lot of those classic Kenyan qualities. Of course, that's going to be the body, the brightness, the berry fruit aspects to it in that brighter sense, plenty of that brightness as well. If you want all of those things, but you're looking for maybe a slightly more sweeter version of that with a little bit more clarity and some of that savoriness toned down, then this one's a really nice fit for you, as I found all of those qualities to be well present and in some regards better than expected. So credit to them one more time on that, and kind of the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Thunguri AA wash processed Kenya from Luna Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.